Okay, so we've talked about many different types of memory, but now we want to talk a little bit about how we can remember things. So, um, I want to make it very clear, something I've already sort of touched on, that your memory is not just like a store of events, right? It's not like a picture or a video or a sound file. Your brain does not work like a computer in most ways, although there's some useful parts of that analogy. But when you are remembering something, it's not that you're just pulling something out. It's that you are actively reconstructing what happened from different associations with the experiences you've had or facts that you know. So you're combining the neural patterns that you have, the traces of information that you are able to combine by firing different patterns in your brain, as well as your expectations. So, this also fits back to my talking about how race can influence our expectations and memories of people, because your racial attitudes might influence how you are reconstructing something. Maybe you remember a person looking differently because you expect them to have a particular facial structure because of their race. So, another way that memories might uh, not reflect reality quite as much as we might like to think. It's also really important to remember how important cues are. Cues are the different indicators, maybe, or the ways that we might find our way to a memory. And the effectiveness of a cue is going to depend on how similar it is to the memory at the time that we formed it, basically. So if you were thinking about topic B while you learned topic A, thinking of topic B is going to help you learn topic A again. So the things that you are thinking about while you're learning something and studying are going to help you remember that thing later on. It's important to try to keep those cues in mind. So this also relates to aspects of our environment and how we're feeling at the time of trying to encode and remember things. So, two related ideas: context dependent and state dependent memory are really important. Context dependent, that if you are, for example, studying and you're in the habit of doing it in your dorm room or your living room or something, then that is going to be a good place for you to remember that knowledge. So being able to take a test in the same place that you are learning material is going to capitalize on context dependent memory, that you're matching the context that you learned something to the context that you're trying to remember it, because you have cues there. You have physical, situational things that are the same and going to help you activate those same patterns of thought. Similarly, state dependent memory: if you learn something when you're calm, it's going to be more difficult to learn that when you're stressed. Also, arguably, if you learn something when you're like using a psychoactive substance, for example, if you're high and you learn something, it might, on average, be easier to remember something when you're in that same psychological state when you're high again. Although there's also an important main effect that some substances make it harder to remember things in general. So there are kind of limits to how well that state dependent memory can work for you. But the way that your body is feeling is also a cue for you. The way that you're feeling at the time of learning is a cue for how you'll remember that thing later. I am also going to talk about this idea much more in the cognition unit, but I want to introduce it now. A schema is a kind of way that we scaffold and structure our knowledge and our memory. So a schema, the organized knowledge structure, the associative network you have in your long-term memory. So if I say eat bread, digest eggs, fruit, fork, plate, meal, dinner, vegetables, you probably are activating a relatively specific schema. What is it? Probably food, right? These are all things that are related to your schema of food. And I activated the word food in your mind without actually saying it. Excuse me. And this relates to the memory reconstruction process, because your schemas are guiding your attention and they're guiding the things that come to mind for you. And your schemas can change the way that you remember things. So, very famous study: Elizabeth Loftus, who's actually still a very active and influential memory researcher. She conducted a study where she showed participants all the same video of a car accident. The only thing she varied, she randomly assigned how she was asking people a question. She asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Or how fast were the cars going when they contacted each other? And had people estimate the speed at which the cars were going. They just answered that question. And there was a sizable difference there that people reliably estimated the cars were going faster when they used framing of the question that suggested they were going faster, even though everyone watched the same video. So people were activating their schemas of like a violent car crash when they heard smashed into, and activating their schemas of like a fender bender when they heard contacted. So the concepts and the words that we're using can affect the way that we remember things. So that has to do, of course, with like accuracy and bias, but maybe more interesting or more useful, perhaps, is how we can promote lasting memory. And this is germane to studying, of course. The most important thing when you are studying is to elaborate on the information that you're studying. So if your schemas are, examples of how you associate concepts in your brain, think of elaboration as building more complex and rich schemas. You're connecting this new idea of, let's say, elaboration to different ideas in your mind. And the more connections you make between elaboration and other schemas and concepts, the better you will remember what elaboration is and how it works, because you'll have more cues and you'll have more connections. So elaboration is creating these connections, essentially. An important idea here is the depth of processing principle, that the number and type of associations that you have is going to make it easier for you to remember something when that number is higher. So the more things you connect a concept to, and the number of times you retrieve it and think about it, is going to increase your memory for it. So that's why studying many times helps. And that's why making lots of connections between a new concept and things you already know is going to help as well. The encoding specificity principle is a bit different, but it kind of fits with some of the things we've already talked about with context and state-dependent memory. The types of associations you form when you first learn something are going to be the most effective retrieval cues. So when you're learning something, the things that you are thinking about, the connections that you're making, are things you should try to be bringing up to mind later to help you remember things about that concept. So if you think of an example of elaboration, or if you remember an example that I'm telling you of elaboration now, because you're learning this now, that cue is going to be very useful for you later on. So some ways you can engage in elaboration, and these would be, again, strategies for studying for this class or any class. They're kind of abstract. Some people find them frustrating, but they do work, is thinking about meaning. So if you're just trying to memorize things from like flashcards, or think about superficial things about a concept, that's going to be less effective than trying to think deeply about the real meaning of things. And some ways to promote even thinking about the meaning of things might be the rest of these strategies. So forming mental pictures, trying to think about not just concepts, but what they might look like or represent to you. And then noticing relationships and noticing differences. I think these two things combined are something people really have trouble with. You might think about like the example of using flashcards to memorize terms, for example. You're probably not thinking about meaning, and you're certainly not thinking about relationships and differences. You're thinking of each of those cards as a unit that you have to remember. But the real way that you're going to learn these concepts better in any class is by noticing the things they have in common and the things that are different to distinguish them from each other. That will enrich the schemas that you have. It'll make connections between elaboration and recognition and recall and amnesia and all the other things that we talk about in this unit. So noticing the differences, noticing the similarities between things and relationships between them, although it takes effort and it takes time, that is how you form lasting memories that you're going to be able to recall when you take an exam, for example. But I don't want to say that distinctiveness is, the most important thing, because there are some misleading things about really distinctive memories. We talk about flashbulb memories as really surprising or emotionally significant types of events, and people often have very rich reported memories of events like these. And people, because they're so rich, they are very, very confident about them. So examples of flashbulb memory targets, basically, a classic one that people use is when the Challenger space shuttle exploded in the 80s. Not something that a lot of people taking this class now have a memory of. Something that happened before I was born, actually. But might people that were alive at that time might have a really rich memory of what it was like to hear about that. For people a little bit older, again, maybe not relevant to many people taking this class, but 9/11 would be another example of that. Or when Barack Obama announced that Osama bin Laden had been killed related to 9/11. So these like big events that have to do with national news basically might be targets for flashbulb memories. And the problem with distinctiveness here is that a lot of times people have way too high of confidence about how this feels. They're not as accurate as people think. And it's not because people are making things up intentionally, or it's not because these memories are particularly bad. It's specifically because people overestimate how accurate these are. They are just as accurate as any other memories, not more, not necessarily less. But people think these important things like, oh man, I remember exactly where I was when JFK was shot, or when the second tower fell, or whatever it happens to be. And it's just not true. It's not more likely that you're remembering that better than you remember something that innocuous that happened to you last week or when you were a kid. Those memories just are not special. They're just memories, the same way anything else is a memory. Some other study tips, kind of after that kind of digression about distinctiveness, some other ways that you might find useful to promote lasting memories. Spacing your repetitions. So this is why cramming does not work. If you study going through the material 10 times in the day before an exam, that's not nearly as good as studying 10 times over the 3 weeks before an exam. Spacing your repetitions is useful. Even though repetition is important, you should repeat knowledge. You should go through the book and the notes several times. You should be making those types of connections and stuff all the time, but you should do it several times, more than once. But trying to have varied and spaced out repetitions is very, very important. Another thing that may be less germane to like complex stuff about a class like this, but in lists, for example, there are things that promote lasting memories and just where something is in a list. And these things are the primacy and recency effects. We remember stuff at the beginning of the list, the primacy effect, primary things in the list, and the recency effect. We remember stuff near the end of the list. So Hermann Ebbinghaus, early memory researcher, is credited with coming up with this thing we call the serial position curve. So the x-axis here is where something comes in a list, more towards the beginning on the left, more towards the end on the right, and the percentage of words being recalled on the y-axis here vertically. And you see this curve here, that there's more memory for things at the beginning and end of a list, and stuff that falls in the middle is just more likely to be forgotten. So you can probably think of examples like grocery lists or somebody telling you movies they like or something like that. You might be more likely to remember the things they say at the beginning and the end relative to things in the middle. Okay, so that's some information. It's hopefully useful about how we remember things and store them and pull them up from our long-term memory. But how do we forget things? Forgetting, let's define that as loss in accessibility of previously stored material. So something you did have in your long-term memory, or alternatively, were holding in your short-term memory, but you've lost accessibility of it. The things that come, when you lose things from your long-term memory, there is a perspective that some of those things are decaying, that memories over time are just going to be lost spontaneously. You're less likely to remember things that happened further ago than things that happened more recently. And this does certainly tend to be true, at least for some innocuous types of information that memory researchers have looked at, and it happens very quickly. So if you have like lists of things that a researcher is asking you to remember, the forgetting curve is going to be fast. You're going to forget maybe up to half of the information in the first 20 minutes, maybe another half of the information over the next day, and then that curve is going to flatten out. That what you remember a day later is not that different from what you remember a month later. So it's not a straight line. It's a very sharp curve that you forget a lot very quickly, and then you retain it with a kind of soft decay after that. But you can soften this curve overall. You can make it so things are lasting a little bit better. So if you are being reminded, encountering a stimulus again, if you're given time to remember things in the first place, if you are giving yourself lots of different cues, like thinking about the relationships between different concepts, how things are similar and different, thinking about things deeply, that is going to make this curve much softer and flatter, so you're not forgetting things as quickly. But really, given how much information we encounter in our day-to-day lives, it's pretty impressive how much we do remember. The world is a very complex place. Lots of things are happening to us, and the fact that we do keep so much is pretty incredible. We also tend to associate aging with losing memory. And if we're going to talk about losing memory with age, we need to think about the different types of memory or memory tests rather, that we have talked about. So as you age, recall is going to tend to decline, just free recall, trying to bring things up without any cues. But recognition doesn't seem to fade nearly as much. People recognize people and can distinguish between true and false things relatively well. It's just that you maybe can't just spontaneously generate information without cues quite as much. The rate at which you're forgetting things also tend to be moderated or attenuated by how familiar you are with something. So an expert engineer that is now elderly is probably not going to forget the important things about engineering, but maybe they forget all sorts of other things that are less important to them. So the more familiar you are with a topic, and this should be unsurprising, right? Because the more familiar you are, the more deep processing you've done about it, the more repetitions you've done with information, the more connections you're making between things, that's going to promote lasting memory. So it makes sense that people in older age are going to remember things that they have processed more and that they are associating more strongly with themselves and their identity and things like that. But why does recall decline overall? It might not be that like the brain just isn't working or the connections are not possible anymore. There's some evidence that it actually is because elderly people end up having more trouble ignoring irrelevant things and keeping irrelevant information from interfering. So it's not necessarily a storage problem. It seems to instead be a retrieval problem. Remember at the beginning, I talked about encoding, storage, and retrieval as the formation, keeping, and bringing up of memory. So storage might be okay, but it seems that retrieval is a process that is interfered with more, and that maybe is the big deal. And it also seems to be the case that the way that we, treat people and culturally how people feel about their station in life and place in life might have an influence too. So if you look at different cultures where people have different expectations about and associations with forgetting in old age and different stereotypes about elderly people, there are differences in people's memories. So memory declines in East Asian countries like China, where aging stereotypes are not as negative and pronounced. You see smaller declines there. So the way that we treat people and think about them and how we think about ourselves seems to have real impacts on people's actual abilities too. But it's not just getting older. It's not just the passage of time. Some memories can influence each other. So learning new information can get in the way of old information, and old information can sometimes get in the way of new information too. I think I maybe said the same thing twice, but I meant old gets in the way of new and new gets in the way of old. So we refer to these things as types of interference. If you're learning material A and then material B, it's possible that they could both kind of interfere with each other. So if old material is getting in the way of learning new material, that's proactive interference. The old material is proactively reaching into the future to get in the way of the new material. Retroactive interference is backward looking. The new material is interfering with, or maybe even overwriting in a sense, the old material. So you can have interference going forward and interference going backward. Both of those things are possible. One piece of evidence for retroactive interference and how we can get around it is that if you sleep after learning, you study right before bed, then that reduces the things that could possibly interfere with older material. If you go to sleep, there's no new learning going on, so there's going to be no retroactive interference. And it does seem that memories consolidate and are stored more effectively if you sleep after you study, which is very interesting. Some other ideas that have to do with forgetting. Repression is an idea about, a really traumatic type of memory that your unconscious mind is sort of keeping you from accessing. And this is an idea that comes from Freud's perspective, psychoanalysis, and how our unconscious mind has so many influences on us. And again, remember Freud's ideas. Some of them are kind of out there. A lot of them don't have tons of evidence, even though he's right that our unconscious minds do matter. He just wasn't always right about how they matter. So nowadays, we tend not to call memories repressed. We tend to say that memories are dissociated, that they are stored, but they're not coming to mind very easily. But there's really very little evidence that this kind of forgetting happens. Much more often, people, just like flashbulb memories, are not better or more durable memories than anything else. Traumatic memories, very similarly, are again, they're just memories. I'm not saying they don't matter and that they cannot be formative experiences. I'm just saying that we don't tend to like cover up and have these deep memories that are like buried in our psyches that come out all of a sudden. We forget them at the same rate we forget anything else. So the idea that you can like go to therapy and have like a spontaneously recovered memory is a very suspect idea that maybe more often is a like a power of suggestion type of thing rather than having something actually be uncovered or something like that. A couple other things to wrap up with are types of amnesia that maybe you're familiar with. A lot of times these are going to result from damage to very specific structures that help us remember things in our brain. And there's a very famous patient that there are many case studies of and papers about known as HM. It's frequently you just have initials for these people to protect their privacy while they're alive. But there was someone who had chronic epilepsy, and a treatment for that was to remove part of his hippocampus, which they knew was going to lead to some sort of decrements. And what happened was he developed amnesia after having this part of his hippocampus removed. So his, living in an institution and being a participant for decades in different studies helped people learn a lot about the function of the hippocampus in memory. So his particular type of memory was anterograde amnesia, that he could not form new memories. Retrograde amnesia, retro is in the past, not recalling events before brain damage. So when someone in a movie or something gets an injury and forgets who they are and what their name is and what their job is and where they live, that's retrograde amnesia, forgetting about the past. Anterograde amnesia, what HM had and what's in like the movie Memento or Dory and Finding Dory can't form, and Finding Nemo, I guess, can't form new memories. That's anterograde amnesia, that you're not making new long-term memories. That once your working memory kind of runs out or you leave something out of your working memory, it's kind of gone. So again, these frequently happen from brain injuries, but sometimes these brain injuries can come not from like trauma and blunt force, but sometimes from things like viral infections or chronic alcoholism can deteriorate certain brain structures enough that you might develop anterograde amnesia too. Wrapping up, sorry this video is getting a little bit long, but I didn't want to break it up into two once I got to a certain point. Where are memories stored? Well, that's a tough question because they're not stored in a single place in the brain. We know that the hippocampus matters a lot from patients like HM and how we form new memories. And a lot of areas around the hippocampus are very active when we're encoding, when we're learning new things. And the amygdala, which we know has a lot to do with emotion and how we experience emotions, is going to affect how we uh, uh, how emotionally charged memories get stored. And we see lots of activity around the amygdala when people are remembering emotional things. However, remember what we talked about in the biopsych unit, that the brain is a system, that there's distributed information and processes across it. So different types of memory do seem to have places that are more active than others, but memories are distributed networks of information across lots, thousands, millions of neurons across your brain. So I'll wrap up there, and thanks.